For this question, I would like to compare cross-sectional, case control, and cohort study. So let's start with cross-sectional study. Cross-sectional study is a type of study that is being done at one point of a time. So let's say, for instance, we want to check the association between wealth and exercise. So we go out there and find out what percentage of wealthy people are actually exercising. So once again, we do not follow over a period of time. We just check one time point for cross-sectional study. And since we do not follow over time, this type of study does not establish causality. If you recall, the definition of prevalence was number of individuals in a population that has a specific condition. So cross-sectional study does actually establish prevalence, since we are looking at present, find out what percentage has a specific condition. Versus case control and cohort do not actually establish prevalence. And finally, incidence is the number of individuals that develop a specific condition over a specific period of time. So let's say, for argument's sake, one person asks you what's the incidence of developing lung cancer in a population, and if the answer is like 10%, it means like 10% of individuals develop lung cancer in 1 year. So again, here we are not following over a period of time, so we cannot establish incidence either. And then the data analysis for cross-sectional study is chi-square test. The next type of study is case control study, which looks into the past. So it's a retrospective study. So case control study, which is a retrospective study. So in this condition, you look into patients that has a specific condition. So let's say, for argument's sake, someone has lung cancer. So you gather 1,000 patients that have lung cancer and then look into the past, ask them what percentage of them started smoking in the past. And then that way you will be able to establish causality between smoking and lung cancer. However, you cannot establish incidence for this type of study, because although you know that they have lung cancer, you don't know when they developed it. Did they develop lung cancer 5 years ago, 4 years ago, or 1 year ago? So you can't tell what percentage of these individuals develop cancer over 1 year of period. And the type of statistical analysis that we would use for case control studies is odds ratio. And then the final type of study that we are going to discuss is the cohort study, which looks into the future. So it's a cohort study, and it's a prospective type of study. So here, the way we look into it is look into the smokers versus non-smokers and find out what percentage of them over time develop a specific condition, let's say lung cancer. Now, since we are following these patients over time, we would be able to establish incidence. For instance, we can tell what percentage of smokers develop lung cancer after 1 year. And again, since we are following over a period of time, we would be able to establish causality for this type of study. And the type of data analysis that we would use for cohort study is relative risk. And so odds ratio and relative risk will help you to estimate the risk for smoking related to lung cancer. Now, one person may ask you, why would we ever bother going with case control study when it doesn't tell you the incidence, versus cohort, which is better controlled, and it does actually tell you the incidence of a disease. In addition, the problem with case control is that you will have to rely on the memory of these patients. They have to tell you what percentage of them were smoking and what was the number of packs of cigarettes that they were smoking. So you actually rely on the memory of these patients, and so there's a risk of recall bias. So the answer to this question is that case control is actually very good for rare conditions. So let's say, just for argument's sake, that there is a disease that there is only 1,000 patients out there that have this disease. So you would go get those 1,000 patients and find the relationship between smoking and that specific rare disease. However, if you gather 1,000 smokers and then hope that in future some of them may develop this disease, maybe one, or there's a chance that none of them will develop that type of rare disease. So there is no point going with prospective study when a disease is really rare. So just keep that in mind. Now, I talked about odds ratio and relative risk, so I would actually like to discuss how to calculate these values. So let's draw a 2 by 2 table. And here we have the disease on the horizontal axis. Patients who have it would be plus, and those who don't have it would be negative. And then the risk factor would be on the vertical axis. Anyone who is exposed to the risk factor would be plus, and those who are not exposed would be negative. Let's assign letter to each box, A, B, C, D. So the first one we would like to measure is odds ratio. And it's quite simple. The way I remember it, it's like a cross. So A times D divided by B times C. So it equals A times D divided by B times C, and that would give you the odds ratio. The next value is the relative risk. And relative risk is the risk of developing that disease in patients who are exposed to the risk factor versus those that are not exposed to the risk factor. So it would be equal A divided by A plus B, and then this whole thing divided by the risk in those who are not exposed to the risk factor. So it would be C divided by C plus D. Now let's summarize what I just explained there. Cross-sectional study will help you establish the prevalence of a disease, but it doesn't tell you causality, it just tells you association. And for that we use the chi-square test. For case control study, on the other hand, we are using odds ratio, and it does help you establish causality. And for cohort, we establish incidence and causality, and it's being evaluated with the relative risk. Now, one question that may bother you is that how to remember that case control is being analyzed by odds ratio and cohort is being analyzed by relative risk. And the way I remember it is like A times O rule or O times A rule. So how it works is that for case control, we are using odds ratio, and for cohort studies we are using relative risk. So here we cannot have 2O or 2 A's in each equation, 1 O and 1 A. So case control goes with odds ratio and cohort goes with relative risk. And that concludes our discussion.